Hello! Thank you for tuning in to the Thought Decoders YouTube channel with me, Sean Mixon, where I teach you how to state and clearly defend your fate. Today we are blessed and privileged. It's a plum-pleasing privilege to invite a great mind, a great Christian mind with us today on the show. None other than Dr. Lydia McGrew. And just by way of short bio, Dr. McGrew, she's been working in the reliability of the Gospels. She specializes in epistemology. One of her recent books was The Mirror or the Mask. She has a forthcoming book on John, the Eye of the Beholder. And today we're focusing on her reportage model of the Gospels. It's a very fascinating study. But before we do that, just want to say hello to Dr. McGrew. How are you doing?
I'm good, Sean. Thank you so much for having me.
We're glad to have you. Thank you for being on with us. Just wanted to start with a few questions, introductory questions. So about yourself, could you tell us what is your educational background?
So I was raised in a Christian home. I went to Bible college when I was just 16 years old. I went kind of young. I got an undergraduate Bible college degree. Then I married my husband, Tim, and we moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where he was getting his graduate degree in philosophy at Vanderbilt University. I got a fellowship to get a doctorate in English at Vanderbilt University, and I finished that English doctorate in 1995. Then I mostly turned my attention to publishing in the field of philosophy, in fact, originally publishing co-written articles with Tim, and then I moved on to publishing individually written articles of my own in the area of analytic philosophy. So I've only published a couple of things in my field of English, and then have established myself as an analytic philosopher by publication record in peer-reviewed journals.
Wow, and you married, you say, to Tim? Is that Dr. Timothy McGrew?
Yep. I mean, he was not Dr. Timothy McGrew when I married him.
That's great. And how long have you been a Christian? What's your story to coming towards the faith?
Right. So I was adopted. I was born to an unwed mother, and I was adopted when I was 7.5 months old by a Baptist family in the Chicago area. And so they raised me in a Baptist Christian home. I accepted Jesus as my personal savior when I was 4 years old, and I still remember it. And I have a teenage daughter, and she'll occasionally say to me, "Mom, I don't see how that could really be. How could you really have accepted Jesus and really understood what you were doing when you were 4?" But I do remember it very clearly. And then I badgered my pastor to baptize me, and he didn't want to because I was so young. And I finally got him to agree when I was 5. And they didn't have any baptismal robes small enough for me, so I had to wear a dress to be baptized. So which then I got completely wet because it was a Baptist church, so it's baptism by immersion. So I always regarded it as sort of a miracle that I was a complete wimp about getting my face wet when I was a child, and I had a lot of trouble learning to swim. How some children are afraid to get their face wet.
Yeah.
But I wanted so much to be baptized that I didn't care that I had to go under the water and get my face wet.
Wow.
I didn't yell or fuss about that, even though usually I would. So anyway, but so in a way, sort of my maturing as a person and my just growing and growing up and my maturing as a Christian have sort of gone together, and it's not always possible to distinguish them, because for all that makes me sound like a sweet little kid, I was a sinner. Even though I was a Christian, I was a sinner. So God has had to do a lot of work in my life in the years since then. And I'm still a sinner, by the way. That hasn't,
Oh, you didn't become perfect?
I didn't become perfect.
Morally perfect?
No, didn't happen.
Okay, well that's great to know. So I understand that one of the areas that you work in is apologetics. Could you tell us what apologetics is? What is that?
Well, normally, it's thought of as the defense of, and the word is usually used in connection with Christianity. I suppose you could have Muslim apologetics as well, but the defense of some religion. And so in Christianity, it would be the defense of Christianity. Now, what's interesting is that very often the idea is that if you're an apologist, you're only looking for arguments on your own side. But a good apologist for anything is going to look at arguments on the other side as well and be able to respond to those and think about those with honesty and not just say I'm only looking for things that support what I've already decided that I believe. So properly done, Christian apologetics will be connected to all kinds of other things: biblical studies, philosophy, moral, ethical discussion, and all kinds of other fields. It'll have connections to those so that the person is well-rounded and is willing to engage with concerns about his own religion as well as arguments for it.
Okay, and what are some of the areas that you've taken an interest to?
Well, I've tried a lot of times to connect it with philosophical issues. So, for example, some of my publications in the philosophy of religion, I've published in other areas that are not related to religion at all, but some of my publications in philosophy of religion have had to do with things like the claim that we can't know what God would do, and so we can't be justified in concluding that God has acted. That's actually been used as an argument against design arguments. I published concerning the philosophy of intelligent design theory, how philosophy intersects with intelligent design theory. Then I got involved with, way back, Tim and I kind of got more into this field because the very famous Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga had made an argument supposedly showing that you could not do a good historical argument for Christianity. I mean, he had done this thing that was just supposed to be like a formal proof, in a sense, that you were never
The
going
problem of dwindling probabilities.
exactly, that you were never going to be able to do a convincing historical argument for Christianity. And then he said that was why you needed to do his Reformed epistemology approach. And we got drawn into that because a friend of ours said, a friend of ours in Iowa, we were visiting Iowa, and he said, you guys are the people to answer that. And so we began working on it and published a response to that, and that drew us to the attention of J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, who were the co-editors of a forthcoming Blackwell anthology on natural theology. And so then they had us write on the argument for the resurrection, and they were very generous with space. They gave us like 60 some pages. It was like a monograph on the argument for the resurrection. So that kind of brought us into that. Then we kind of saw that we needed to really bring out more, especially some old forgotten arguments for the reliability of the Gospels, which we had used there. And Tim became very involved in that historical apologetics and bringing back those old arguments, that had been forgotten. And then he got me interested in it. And so now I'm working in New Testament studies.
And so you guys have like a library for anyone who's interested in like historical apologetics, where you've kind of compiled a bunch of different books that people can access.
That's been Tim's project. Yeah, that's been Tim's project. He owns that domain. It doesn't change a whole lot. It kind of remains what it is, but he's compiled. They're free. That's the thing. These are all in public domain. They're old enough that you can just download them, and it's legal. It's not like a pirate site or anything.
Man,
completely legal downloads where they put them all in one place with little blurbs about the authors and that kind of thing, little blurbs about the books. So these are, a lot of them are like 19th century and older works of apologetics that we really need to bring back. We need to access again.
Lost knowledge.
Yeah, lost knowledge, exactly.
I remember coming across the website and was like, this is, oh my God, it was free. Like that was the first observation. I said, this is free. Wow. And what? Do you mind sharing that website address with the audience?
It's historicalapologetics.org, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, good. That's a wonderful, wonderful resource. Uh, let me ask you this: with your apologetics approach, there is a distinction that many people in this area typically make. If not a sophisticated one, but they distinguish between presuppositional
Mm-hmm.
apologetics and some type of evidentiary.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I know of your approach, you guys' approach, and there it is pretty. It's really it has an evidentiary. I mean, a strongly evidentiary component. So when
Which
I
is,
when I ask you this question, I kind of hesitate
mhm.
because I know that you know, your epistemology, I believe, is it an internalist
Mm-hmm.
epistemology that you have? So y'all are very strong on evidence and
Mm-hmm.
in its relationship to knowledge. So, but in terms of presupposing the truth of Christianity, is that something? Is that a starting point for your apologetic approach?
Well, socially, obviously, a person's not going to call himself a Christian apologist if he isn't, historically speaking, already a Christian, right? I mean, nobody gets interested in apologetics in doing it for a religion he doesn't
Yes.
believe. But
Right.
argumentatively, no, it's not a starting point. Argumentatively, the idea is that these things can be shown to be true on their own. I think you might call my approach macho evidentialist. Rambo evidentialism. I mean,
Wow.
completely non-presuppositional. In fact, there's a Four Views book out there, and I'm trying to think the title, but anyway, it's Four Views on Christian apologetics, and it's my husband Tim, Scott
Oh, okay.
Oliphant, Paul Moser, and then on the skeptical side, Graham Oppie. And
Wow.
I've read, all of those contributions, and I don't think it's just my bias that Tim's was the best response to Graham Oppie in there, and Oppie's things was very interesting as well. Just as a representative of the skeptical side. So I think if someone says, "Oh, Graham Oppie's a really good opponent to Christianity," who is there out there who can answer him? The answer is not only can Tim McGrew, he already has, and it's in a book. So
Get the book.
get the book, man. Yeah.
Yes, I love it. I love it. And so, what about so coming towards more into, you have a book, uh, you have a book that you recently, I guess it's one of your recent books where you go into the reportage model
Mm-hmm.
of the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
You deal first negatively with the treatment of a certain literary approach to the Gospels, and then afterwards you argue for a positive position and an interpretation of the Gospels. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that book is The Mirror or the Mask. That came out just about exactly 1 year ago. My previous book was Hidden in Plain View, which also supports the reportage model, but I happened to coin the word in between there. And so The Mirror or the Mask is the subtitle is Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. And I mean specifically those fact-changing literary devices, and the idea that I'm opposing is the idea that at times the gospel authors sort of massage the facts in various ways, change them, some smaller, some larger, and that was because they thought that was allowed by the standards of their time. So, as you say, in the first part of the book, I respond to that. I go very carefully and thoroughly into all the reasons that are brought to say that's what was going on. And I say, no, for this reason, this reason, this reason, that's not really a thing, and that's not really the thing they were doing. But then in the second part, I argue for positively for this notion that they were always trying to get it right. They were always reporting what they sincerely believed to be true, and they were highly successful at getting it right. So it wasn't just they were trying, but they kept getting it wrong all the time, but that they were actually had access to sources close to the facts and were able to get it right. And that's what I call the reportage model.
Okay, so I'm hearing one is that they're reliable.
Right. Very highly
And
reliable. Yeah.
they're highly reliable. So that bolsters the claim that the Gospels are historically reliable because the writers were extremely reliable witnesses. And then the other point is that they were actually wrote down. I have a quote from you from one of your lectures. If I can find it amongst all of
And of
this
course, Mark and
scratch.
Luke would have had access to witnesses. Mark and Luke were not personally, acquainted with Jesus, but they would have been able to talk to people who were.
Because it said that Mark received his information from Peter.
I would say, yeah. I mean,
That's one of the explanations, and Luke was acquaintances with Paul, and
then I think Luke then, through his acquaintance with Paul, had a chance to get to know other disciples as well, especially in the Jerusalem area.
Okay, and so I have it's something of a quote. It says, your reportage model holds that the Gospels were written by truthful people with knowledge of the events close up to the time of the events, and they don't represent later accretion or fictional distortion.
There you go. That's fair.
Okay. And so basically, I'd summarize it. They report what they believed happened.
And had good reason, to believe that's what happened.
Okay. And so we've gone through what the reportage model is. Can you explain now what are some evidences for the reportage model?
So I've got various categories. I tried to make them all start with you, so it would be all alliterative, but I couldn't get that all to work out all the time. But one of them is what I talked about in my earlier book, Hidden in Plain View, and those are called undesigned coincidences, and we can go into more detail about what those are. Another is what I talk about in The Mirror or the Mask, I call unnecessary allusions or unexplained allusions. So these are like when somebody says that they went somewhere for a couple of days and doesn't say why. And that's not the kind of thing that you would really retain if you were doing this highly literary massage kind of thing. Instead it's got the sound of if you're talking to somebody and they're just telling you about a series of events and they just kind of throw in these irrelevant things or these things that you're not necessarily going to understand. So that's unexplained allusions. Another is unnecessary details. So you've got these little vivid touches that come up, like in Mark, where it says that when Jesus was asleep in the boat, he was asleep on a pillow. That's only in Mark. So you can imagine that Peter, it was probably Peter's pillow, it was probably Peter's boat. Unnecessary details. And then, wait a minute, maybe I am going to get all starting with you. Unique personalities. There we go.
Uh-oh.
I did it. Anyway, so I have a section in The Mirror of the Mask on the personality of Peter, and how there are all these different stories about him in different gospels, and yet it's so clearly the same person. In my forthcoming book, The Eye of the Beholder, obviously, I'm going to be discussing Jesus and Jesus' personality, and how the Jesus we meet in John is the same as the Jesus that we meet in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though they're different stories. And then I also talk about something called reconcilable variation. There, we got an R. But this has to do with where it might seem that, these are so different, and yet they're not. Again and again, maybe not invariably, there are some intractable apparent discrepancies, but virtually all the time we can see how they can fit together and be reconciled plausibly. And, that could so easily have not been the case. When you get witnesses who are just lying, they're going to end up just being hopelessly contradictory, especially if they don't have an opportunity to collude with each other. And so you're not going to have reconcilable variation. So that's another evidence of of historicity. So those are just some of the categories for the reportage model.
Okay. So now let's uh I'll come back to that. So, but first, let me ask you this, because a lot of lay Christians, it's they may not understand the dynamics of the conversation, of the dialectic, if you will. So, inerrancy. Could you define inerrancy?
Well, I haven't written the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, but it is out there. A lot of people have worked very hard to define inerrancy, but I definitely think that inerrancy includes the idea that there is no factual error in what the authors are affirming. So, even on historical matters, that seems to be an obvious thing. So, therefore, for example, if Mark says there was a pillow in the boat, there was a pillow in the boat. In other words, that if Mark made up the pillow, then that would be in conflict with inerrancy. So, I think we can take just sort of an ordinary view and define inerrancy in that way. However, I should say right up front here, and I think we may have talked about this ahead of time, I don't consider myself an inerrantist, and that's partly because I don't mess around with the word. So because I take that word in the way that I think the people who coined it and have used it and the people to whom it is most important intend it, I don't want to play any games with those people. I want to tell those people up front, no, I don't take that position. And the interesting thing is that I've found that they really appreciate that, that they would rather somebody just say, right, I know what you guys mean by inerrancy, and I'm not one, than that you say, well, how do we define? Let's try to redefine this word. And there are so many different meanings that you could possibly have, and so forth. So maybe Mark could have made up the pillow and it would still be inerrant. And so you get these very strange scenarios here in the early 21st century, where you have views that people call inerrancy. They say they are inerrantists, but that are in fact incompatible with the reliability of the Gospels. So it's so weird. It's like, they're inerrant, but historically they have all these things that are changed and made up. So that's a real head scratcher for you, because if inerrancy means anything, it at least means reliability, but inerrancy just goes farther.
Right. So that's an interesting point you're making. It sounds like you're just saying, I mean, if you're not an inerrantist, just say it. Don't try to redefine inerrancy in the sense that it has no meaning. And it's interesting because I saw Bart Ehrman on in a dialogue. I can't remember who he was speaking with, but he had just come from a conference or some type of forum on inerrancy, and Dr. Mike Licona was
on
there.
On the Gospels. I mean, inerrancy was being discussed, but I know about that was in the fall of 2019. That conference.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so he was actually telling the person, he says, apparently what I used to think inerrancy meant has changed. He was like, I was on this forum and they were like saying that, they were admitting everything I was admitting, except they were
saying they were inerrantists. I know.
Right. And he said, so apparently he said they have this, his thing was the definition. And so they have a definition. The one I've heard is that scripture is correct in everything that it teaches. Right, but then what does it teach?
Right,
becomes the question, and then who can figure?
Right. So take the example I gave about the pillow in the boat. Right. Suppose we say Mark is trying to teach about Jesus' power over the wind and the waves. Right, because that's the story where they are afraid and all of that. And so, Scripture is true. It is true that Jesus had power over the wind and the waves. And that would be true, even if Mark just invented that pillow out of the back of his head because he said, hey, I think it would make a better story or something. And so it doesn't matter, and so forth. One of the interesting things about that is that Scripture is often confirmed in its detail. And so what we'll find is that, everybody loved my first book. Okay. Hidden in Plain View. You can see the endorsements there. because I wasn't being quite so controversial. And so I was bringing forward this positive evidence for the Gospels. But what was interesting is that was confirming details. Like it was confirming that the grass was green at the time of the feeding of the 5,000, or confirming that Jesus specifically turned and had a conversation with Philip, specifically Philip, at the feeding of the 5,000. And I could give example after example where it refers to the details of the story, and then we find these to be confirmed. Or, for example, we found a stone quarry near Cana where they actually made stone water pots. And
Wow.
so then John says that there were 6 water pots at the wedding at Cana made out of stone. And so we've confirmed, historically, and that would be for Jewish purification reasons, because stone doesn't become impure like with like if you've ever seen
With clay.
unglazed pottery, you can actually have blood or something soak into that, and then it's not
Wow.
it can't be used for other kinds of uses. Whereas stone, you can light a fire and purify stone, right? And so even though stone, to make your dishes out of stone, they're going to be really heavy and unwieldy, but it's
Wow,
worth
that's
it for
crazy.
purification reasons. So we've confirmed that. Okay. But so then if we
Wow.
go out there and we say, oh, well, the details don't matter, they could have made up the details, that's just details, just details, just details, then what we're doing is we're throwing out a lot of expected confirmation of the Gospels. And even theology depends on details. Like, did Jesus really eat with the disciples after he rose from the dead? Was he physically present with them? If we just say, well, but they could change the details, or they could invent the details, now the theological doctrine of the physical resurrection of Jesus is called into question.
Okay. So that makes a lot of sense. It puts things into perspective, and we may need to do a part 2 on this on this interview. But I wanted to ask. So when you say a model, the Reportage model, what do you mean by model there?
So I'm thinking of it sort of from the perspective of the philosophy of science. So in the philosophy of science, what do? You have theories, right? So you have Newtonian physics, you have Einsteinian physics, you have quantum physics, and so forth. And then you take that and you try to check it. You try to look at the data and say, do the data support this model? And so that's what I'm doing. I've got this idea. This is what the Gospels are like. And I believe that that is supported. It's like a hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis I think is overwhelmingly well supported. But I call it a model because I'm thinking of it in terms of, theory and data. And so that's the theory. And then I say, look, this is confirmed by the data.
Now, the way you frame that, I wonder, which direction do we start with? I mean, because I've heard people say that you can start with the theory, but in actuality, since a scientist is already involved in the science process, does he really start with the theory, or does his previous experiences kind of culminate, and the theory is an explanation of that data, and then you look for, since the theory explains all the data within his experiences, now he's forward looking for, okay, let me see if I can find data that disconfirms my theory, because I've already come to this explanation of all the previous data, and then let me try to find disconfirmation of my theory.
Or could see if there's more data that confirm it. I mean, it could go either way, right? Well, it's funny you should say that. I'm planning a video right now on the question of theory, data, mutual support, and modeling that in connection with like the deity of Jesus and miracles. They're a circle. Do we say, oh, I believe in the deity of Jesus, so I believe he could perform miracles, and now I think I have evidence that he could perform miracles, so I believe he was God? And is this circular reasoning, and why is this not circular reasoning, and so forth? Because that was an area of our special research interest, because we were foundationalists in philosophy. And so there was this question, foundationalists you're only going to have arrows going one way. You're never going to have any actual loops. You're never going to have any actual circular reasoning. Can you
Mm-hmm.
account for
Mm-hmm.
theory, data, mutual support? And it turns out you can, but it was interesting to get that modeling going, and the Bayesian modeling was very helpful there. That's connected to something called Bayes' theorem. I don't mean to go off onto a digression, but anyway,
Oh man,
uh,
that's good. It's good stuff.
in,
Thank you so much.
the question of which you start from, we do have to distinguish the context of discovery from the context of the modeling of our reasons in some kind of synchronic moment when we have our reasons. In the context of discovery, of course, as you know, people are often sort of inspired to think of a theory, but they're not sure whether it's true or not. I mean, if you ever read a detective novel, you'll see this. All of a sudden, the detective says, oh my goodness, maybe that guy is the guilty person. He doesn't believe it yet. He's been maybe inspired to conjecture. Maybe at that point it's just a conjecture. And so then he goes out there and he sees, he checks some things to see if it holds up. So in the context of discovery, maybe you could say, in a sense, you start with the theory just as a conjecture, as an inspiration, but nobody, there's this caricature of the scientific method, observe, hypothesize, like you're just going to sit there. And Tim loves to do this with his students. Okay, observe. I'm not going to tell you what you're observing, just observe. Obviously observation is going to be directed at something in particular. What am I trying to observe? And what am I investigating? So sometimes you need alternatives or possibilities to even know what kind of questions to ask in the first place. So in the context of discovery, you can kind of start anywhere you want, as long as you're sensitive to the actual evidence that is coming in, and you're willing to revise maybe preconceptions that you had, or change your views or whatever. But when it comes to, your conclusions, you definitely don't just say, well, I just believe the Bible's the word of God. And so, I don't think you should, I'm just going to believe that no matter what. And just say you're going to stick to that, stubbornly. You certainly should be open to disconfirmation. And that's why I'm glad to be able to tell people that instead I have found confirmation.
That's interesting, because what you said raises other questions in my mind, like the question of the role of intuition within the epistemic context, because there are these insights that people have. And I thought about Albert Einstein. It said, well, the myth, the legend is that he was sitting in a chair and he just had the theory of general relativity to just pop in his head, and as he was doing some thought experiment. But that it's interesting that you would say that. And what I'm going to do right now is, this has been great and wonderful, but I'll go ahead and let's wrap up this interview. And it's been such a plum pleasing pleasure that I would love to have you back for a part 2. And what do you say?
Yeah, well, maybe we could talk about the Gospel of John, specifically, because I'm hoping that my book, The Eye of the Beholder, on the Gospel of John, it should be coming out in the spring, hopefully sometime in March. I'm not at liberty to give a specific date yet. We're still waiting for some things to come in, but I want to promote that, as much as I can, because John has come under a special scrutiny. And from some of these folks that I was already interacting with in the Mirror or the Mask, where even people who will affirm the historicity fairly strongly, certain amount of historicity of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when it comes to John, they're like, oh, I don't know, he may be more theological or something like that. He's so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so we just can't be sure. And so it was sort of a structuring principle of my book that on John, The Eye of the Beholder, that I tried to focus on arguments that sort of weakened the historicity of John that have impressed evangelicals. And I don't know of any other book that's done that. Now, it turns out there's some of the same arguments that have impressed non-evangelicals. Of course, there's going to be overlap there. But that was sort of my structuring or my governing principle, because I find that sometimes when lay people hear that something has impressed an evangelical thinker, they'll think, well, then that must be a really strong argument, because otherwise he would not accept it. And so what I was trying to do is to show that no, they're the same bad arguments that are impressing the non-evangelicals. They're not that strong, but that was how I kind of picked my arguments. So for example, I spend 3 chapters on the question of how Jesus sounds in the Gospel of John, because that's been an argument that's been hammered, that Jesus just sounds different. It's like a different accent or a different way of talking.
He sounds like John.
He sounds like John. That's the exact.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
That's
Yeah.
what you've heard. Everybody's heard it. It's what they call a meme. It's a meme out there. Well, Jesus in John sounds like John. So that means that John is putting his own words in Jesus' mouth.
Right.
He's changing what Jesus says way more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. And I spent 3 chapters debunking that from about every possible angle. And and I don't know of any other book that does that, even though there are other good books out there on John. So that would be fun. We could come and talk about that after the book has been released. And then, you could have a little link and people could just click and order it. And that would be great.
Yeah, after I got my copy. But so one last question before I stop we end the stream here. Now, so you've described the reportage model as a theory. Theories are meant to explain data. What is the data that your theory, that the reportage model is meant to explain?
So some of them would be the things I listed before, the unexplained allusions, and we didn't talk a whole lot about what undesigned coincidences are, but they're these puzzle-like fittings between the different documents where one will explain another. And I give a bunch of examples of that in my book, Hidden in Plain View. So that's data. That's there. Even just minor verbal variations. And what we find is that this is what witnesses sound like. Okay, this is something that the cold case detective J. Warner Wallace has really emphasized, that when you interview witnesses for a living, as he's done as a detective, and lawyers will say the same, that this is what you find. So William Paley, the great 18th century divine, author, he was a divine, is a British clergyman. He said that substantial agreement under circumstantial variety is the normal character of truthful witness testimony. And so that's the data, that when we look at them, we find that that's what they look like. They don't look like literary creations. They look like they came, maybe not immediately, maybe at like one remove in the case of Luke or Mark, from people who were actually there. So we find the variances, the agreements, the mutual explanations, the unexplained allusions, and all these kinds of things. And that's the data that theory can explain. In fact, even apparent contradictions, I think, are well explained by the reportage model, because, again, to quote J. Warner Wallace, he said, you will find that they will appear at times to contradict one another. So he gives an example of a pair of witnesses to a robbery, I think, and one of them said the robber left on foot. And then the other witness said he got in a car and he drove away. And then it actually turned out that they were both right, because one was looking out the window in a certain way and saw, the guy run away. And then the other was looking from a different perspective and saw him get into a car. And so the reportage model can even explain that. It can also accommodate real discrepancies if there are any, and a narratist would not think there are any real ones. But even if there are some real discrepancies, as long as the witnesses are not infallible, they can actually contradict one another at points. But if they're truthful, especially if they're highly truthful, highly reliable, that's not going to happen a lot.
Right. And okay, that's a great place to end our interview for today. I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. McGrew, for joining us, and to the audience here, thank you so much for being with us today. You've been here with Sean Mixon, Dr. Lydia McGrew on the Thought Decoder channel, and here we teach you logic. We teach you how to clearly state and defend your faith. Always remember to think better. Thank you.